Subscribe to our YouTube channel and don't forget to press the bell icon to get all the latest updates. Hello and welcome. I'm Barkha Dutt. You're with the Mojo Story. Every generation has clashes with the one that follows it and the one that comes before. But perhaps the most talked about, in focus, written about, and widely debated generation is the one that we call millennials. Let's bring up our special focus today as we look at India's millennials. We are looking at the aspirations and anxieties of millions of young Indians. There is, in fact, a new book out that is specifically exploring the varied attitudes of this generation to everything from politics to sex and sexuality, as also how COVID has impacted, in particular, this generation of millennials. Remember, this is a very large number of young Indians that we're talking about. An estimated 440 million Indians fall into this bracket that we call millennials. And we're also looking at their anxieties given the economic impact of COVID, as well as the economic uncertainty, and how this might have impacted the attitudes of this particular generation. Let's speak now to a young author, Vivan Marwaha, who has been spending many years looking at the attitudes of millennials. He is out with a new book now, What Millennials Want, that eternal question to which only the very brave would hazard an answer. Vivan has made that attempt and he joins us now. Vivan, welcome to the Mojo Story, and I'm really intrigued to discover what you may have found out in the process of writing this book, because I know that you've spent a considerable time studying what this generation wants. Is it liberal? Is it conservative? How free is it really? And one of the things that your book, in fact, argues is that while millennials may not be a monolith, the one thing that seems to unite Indian millennials is the economic uncertainty. Talk a little bit about that. Is that COVID specific, or was it even before the pandemic?
Well, thanks for having me on, Barkha. And this is a really important topic because India's youth is India's future. India's millennials and its young population was called a demographic dividend. And the entire thesis was that as India's youth get jobs, as they make more money, they consume goods and services, and in turn, they become nation builders that contributes to India becoming a middle income and then a high income country. Now, as you said, COVID has impacted India's youth considerably. But it's not like Indian millennials and Indian youth were doing very well before coronavirus. In 2019, in January, if you remember the business standards story that broke on the NSSO leaked data, that we had 45-year high unemployment in India at the time. And this data set became a huge source of controversy. But I already saw that a year ahead when I was out in small towns across, Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, Kerala, Karnataka, where I just saw unemployed young men and women everywhere. I would go and talk to young men and women and I'd ask them, well, what are you guys doing? Are you working? Are you studying? And I met so many people who had advanced degrees, who had multiple degrees, but they didn't have jobs. And we're in the situation that before coronavirus, the country wasn't creating enough jobs. There's a figure that almost 1 million Indians enter the workforce every month. And we're not creating nearly enough those many jobs to absorb just the people who are entering right now, much less for the folks who are going to be entering in the future. And now that's before COVID-19. Now, during COVID-19, we saw stories of bank managers, of MBAs, of engineers with advanced degrees digging ditches in villages as part of Manrega. And people who had the few stable jobs that were available were now digging ditches for manual labor. And the economy has just been set back 10 years. And I don't know how much longer it's going to take to recover.
So let me ask you this. On the one hand is this economic uncertainty. On the other hand, we have the famed millennial obsession with work-life balance. And I say this because I clearly come from a generation before the millennial generation, and work consumes me, and it continues to consume me even at the age of 49 years old. But I find that with the millennials, it's very tough to convince them that work is central to identity. And on the one hand, you have this obsession with work-life balance. On the other hand, you have this economic uncertainty. This paradox, how has it shaped Indian millennials? Obviously, there will be a class stratification. Some people just have to work and cannot be subsidized by their families. Others don't. So how has this uncertainty combined with the kind of work-life balance, at least among elite urban millennials, shaped the attitude to work?
So, Barkha, there's a saying about India is that you can say one thing and it's true, and you can say the polar opposite, and that is also true. And that's because we live in an incredibly diverse country. So there's a lot of people in Delhi, in Mumbai, in Bangalore, in Hyderabad, who have good private sector jobs, who work at technology companies or multinationals, and they crave work-life balance. And those individuals are very similar to their millennial counterparts in the United States, in England, in Australia, in Singapore, and even in China. And so those people, like millennials around the world who are employed in these types of jobs, they want work-life balance, and corporations must take their needs into account while creating HR policies and hiring policies. But then there's this much
But
larger
but
group
but
of
but, but,
people.
but there's a very severe generational clash on this issue.
Absolutely, and I know what you're going to in with woke culture and
And I'll come to all of that, but there is some sense among older people, and I know that they're dismissed as baby boomers or uncles or aunties, but that's actually, it's, that's also a kind of broad stroke, right? And we must all avoid broad strokes. But there is this generational clash, and I find it, among my peers who are in other professions, whether they're lawyers, whether they're bankers, whether they're journalists, any profession, and the complaint from my generation will be millennials are not ready to work as hard as we were.
Can you hear me?
I can. Go ahead.
Okay, perfect. So, Barkha, I think this is in a lot of ways related to India's growth story. And if you look at my parents' generation, I think they're a few years older than you. In a lot of ways, they had to work for everything they had. And my parents often tell me we had to take DTC buses and we had to do all of these things that you children don't have to do. And so a lot of the millennials who you were talking about, who work in Gurgaon and who work in high tech city and who work in Whitefield, they are the children of these individuals who in a lot of ways have not had to worry about not having food or not having an air conditioned room to study in or having to take a DTC bus and being unsafe. So millennials do not, the people you were talking about have not had to worry about those concerns. So for them, their concerns are, well, how do I navigate a boss who is incredibly rude and misogynistic? Or how do I navigate a culture where I have to work 15 hours a day and I don't have time to work out or to take care of myself or to take care of my mental health? And so I understand exactly what you're saying. But as India becomes a richer country and a lot of people move out of that need where they're just looking for basic necessities, they are ultimately going to optimize on their lives and move
So
towards
if it
better
isn't
spaces.
work, so if it isn't work that defines urban millennials, and because let's be clear that the kind of thing that we're talking about comes from privilege and families who are willing to subsidize their kids, if identity is not defined by work in this generation, what is it defined by?
Well, Barkha, most of my research has focused on small town India, and I stayed very far away from Delhi, from Gurgaon, from Mumbai, and even from some of the better parts of Bangalore. I am more. I believe that the big story that we're missing out on are those who don't have any work, and those in small town India women who do not have a safe way to commute to the few work opportunities that are available. And I understand that there are concerns that urban millennials have with work culture and with creating safe workspaces. It's just not appropriate for me to comment on those because it's not where I've done majority of my research or my interviews.
Okay, I would like you to talk about the intersection of this economic uncertainty and what's that doing in shaping political attitudes. Because I know that some of your earlier work found that the voting preferences of millennials had nothing to do with preferring someone their own age. So, for example, millennials, and the data now bears this out, overwhelmingly preferred Narendra Modi to Rahul Gandhi. So, there wasn't an age filter in their political choices. But now, with this economic uncertainty, faced with no certain job prospects, has this influenced their political preferences, or has the absence of an effective opposition kept their political preferences pretty much the same?
Thanks for that question because it has influenced their political preferences, but in the opposite, in the counterintuitive manner. Because, like I said, in 2019, 5 years of the Modi government, India had its highest ever youth unemployment, 45-year high youth unemployment. In any other country, the incumbent government, which is responsible for those conditions, gets punished. In India, what happened, and I saw this in my interviews, every young voter I was talking to in a Hindi state was telling me they were going to be re-electing the prime minister, which in a lot of ways is completely counterintuitive to what happens in other countries where those responsible for creating these conditions gets thrown out. But the deeper analysis over here is that Indian millennials are in this state of anxiety. They're in a state of complete uncertainty and instability because there are no jobs. Now, combined with the fact that there's no strong opposition in India, the leader who promises them some level of stability, that if you are someone from a majority community, I have your back. I am going to be your guardian. If you remember, Barkha, every BJP leader on Twitter in 2019 had changed their handle to Chaukidar. Chaukidar Sushma Swaraj, Chaukidar Amit Shah, Chaukidar Narendra Modi. These people weren't just Chaukidars against Pakistan and Balakot, but they were going to be protecting you and keeping you safe from enemies, foreign and domestic. And so, what the message was that we understand that there's instability in your life, and we are the ones who are going to provide you some stability. We are the ones who are going to provide you with a little bit of a safe environment.
And do you find that that remains the case even after COVID or through COVID?
Absolutely. If you look at the opinion polls, which I have a lot of problems with the way they're conducted, I mean, they show 65, 70% support, but I also have done some field work. I did some field work last year, not after the second wave though. And I was talking to young people, and they've sort of all absolved Modi and the government of coronavirus because at the end of the day, it is a global pandemic. It's affected every government around the world, whether it's liberal, whether it's conservative, whether it's nationalist or not. And in India, there's sort of this acceptance that the government is not to blame. We are to blame for what happened. Now, the caveat is that's before the second wave, so I don't know how things have changed after that. But the economy is not doing much better. So it's going to be interesting to see what the next 6 months look like.
But it's your hunch that there won't be a political cost among these, millions of young people. Let's say, in contrast to the United States of America, where despite how down Biden is right now, Trump basically lost only because of COVID.
Absolutely. And in the United States, they convinced the population that the president, in an incredibly federal country where governors, mayors, and city councils have a lot of power, was somehow responsible for the entire management of the pandemic. And in a lot of ways, the White House is responsible. But in India, the Prime Minister's office has even more power. And we saw that in March 2020, when the entire country was shut down on a moment's notice. We saw the migrants. We saw how there was just nothing. You could not leave your house. And there's somehow the opposite reaction over here that no, the government is not to blame. We are to blame. We are the people who are going to correct our behavior. And that's something very interesting, which goes beyond just millennials, because every section of the population, in some way or the other, feels this way. So it's not a youth-centric issue, but the millennials and young people are disproportionately impacted.
Yeah, you do find that young people and millennials continue to endorse their idea of alpha maleness in leadership.
Absolutely. You go and talk, including women, including young women, and you go and talk to, the people I've spoken to in small town India. I was doing interviews in Indore right before the 2019 elections, and they were telling me Modi ji ka, 56 in chest, and he's the person who's going to keep us safe. And then they were talking about Rahul Gandhi, who's the opposition leader, as a pappu, as a lightweight. at someone who doesn't really know what they're doing. Modi, if I write this in my book, he's not somebody who speaks about aspiration, but he wears aspiration. He embodies aspiration. He's somebody who rose up, according to his story, as the son of a tea seller and has now made it to the prime minister's office. He's someone who does not speak good English, and that is an incredible asset to his rise and to his journey, because most young Indians are not native English speakers. But the elite of this country, traditionally, and particularly during the UPA years, were English speaking, Western educated dynasts. And they had very little connect with the country they were governing. And then Modi comes onto the scene, and Yogi Adityanath comes onto the scene, and these are people who've risen up from the absolute grassroots of politics, and in their appeal and in their personalities lies their political appeal.
But can I ask you, I think it's quite well established now that young people do not see Mr. Gandhi as a kind of preferred political option in any significant way. But what about the self-made aspirational story of other leaders? So, for example, there was an Arvind Kejriwal who also was a kind of middle-class aspirational story, right? He was an IIT boy, middle-class family, self-made, launched a movement against corruption, goes on to become the chief minister, now has expansionist ambitions. There's a Mamata Banerjee, self-made, not a dynast. So I mean, these are the two people I can think of off the bat who are not dynasts and who are self-made.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think they are I was in Bengal during the elections, and I did a little bit of interviews and surveying, and Mamata Banerjee was beloved by the people over there. And I couldn't understand any of the analysis coming out of some of the Delhi news channels and the Delhi magazines that were predicting a BJP government, because everyone I was talking to was very favorable towards Mamata Banerjee. And I think if you look at the three leaders you mentioned, their appeal is all the same, that they have risen up from middle class or humble origins, and that they speak the language of the people. Arvind Kejriwal is a street fighter. He came up from the streets. Mamata Banerjee came up from the streets against the communist government. In 1990, 1991, she was beaten on the head by the communist government. These are people who understand street level politics. And so and some of them are in the Congress. Bhupesh Baghel in Chhattisgarh is also someone who came up from the absolute grassroots. And so I think the thesis over here is not that it's just about Modi or it's just about the BJP, but it's about these leaders who come up organically as opposed to people who are imposed from the top.
Your book, and you have said that India's millennials are caught in a way between anxiety and aspiration, and it is
Absolutely.
an anxious time. It's an anxious time for them. What explains then that that they do not hold the present government responsible for that economic insecurity that they feel gripped by, or that their aspirations feel curtailed by? What explains that Prime Minister Modi is virtually a Teflon Prime Minister?
Before I answer your question, I do want to talk about the aspiration, because I wasn't given an opportunity to do so. And this aspirational quality is incredible, and you see it in every city and town you go to. There's a promise of modernity, a promise of leveling playing fields, of dissolving gender barriers and creating opportunity where you earlier just had dead ends. And there's a sense that there's no longer any limits that are standing in this generation's way, that they haven't evaporated, but there's still an incredible promise of opportunity. Now, in a lot of ways, that promise still exists, which is why we don't always see the Prime Minister held accountable. There's this sense that if not today, tomorrow, maybe my life can get better. And I think that's the silver lining in the research that I've done and in the people I've spoken to, that even though conditions might be really bad today, tomorrow might be better. I might be able to create a better life for my child than I have for myself. And so I'm willing to give this person another chance, because I know that tomorrow I might have a better life for myself. So I think the silver lining is that while economic conditions might not be good today, and they're not good at all, employment is non-existent in many parts of this country, is that there is a hope that tomorrow would be better than today. And that the person who can deliver those opportunities is the person who's in power right now. And then there's also the entire
And so why is the person who's in power not held to be at fault for the economic uncertainty is a very interesting political question to answer.
Because we live in a, and there's a great book on this that's come out from another author, we live in an age where there's always doubt being sown about reality and about facts and about information. That, oh, you might have this problem today, but look at the fact that the New York Times called Taliban stalwarts while they call the BJP extremists. Hey, that's more important than the problem you have today. Or the fact that the Taliban is in government right now in Afghanistan, that is more important than the fact that you don't have a bathroom in your village today, or that you lost a job 2 years ago and that job has never come back. It's because we live in the age of smartphones and cheap data, where there's this deluge of information, and it's goes by drip, 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 drip. That every day there's a new story to distract people from what's actually going on in their lives, and it's working. It's not just working in India, it works around the world. We've seen this in Brazil, we've seen this in the Philippines, that misinformation is literally causing people, and in the United States with vaccines, is causing people to really just completely abandon all sense of knowledge.
I get what you're saying, but then the question would be, what makes millennials angry? Because the last time I saw young people take to the streets, it was not millennials, it was the Gen Z generation. And I'm talking, of course, about the protests against the citizenship legislation, which was essentially led by young people who were probably college going, between the age of 18 and early 20s, and not the 30 somethings. You did not see the 30 somethings who would be the sort of the classic millennials out on the streets. In that case, my question to you would be, what would bring millennials out on the street? What would make millennials angry?
To be honest with you, Barkha, I will say I don't know, because I've spoken to people who haven't had jobs for years, and people who've tried to take the UPSC multiple times and have failed, people who have, not good lives, and they are not the type of people who are coming out onto the streets and protesting. And when you go out and you look at the price of fuel, which is so high right now, you look at the fact that most young people cannot buy their own homes, they cannot buy their own cars. If they have cars, they can't fill them up at the gas station. And if that is not causing people to come out, I don't know what will, because these are, kitchen table issues. They affect everyone in society. And with the price of living increasing disproportionately with the rise in wages in this country, if that hasn't, caused people to come out onto the streets, I really don't know what will.
And is that because millennials are somewhat detached from the larger politics around them? Or is it because it's the failure of the opposition?
Millennials are not detached from the larger political arena. It's just that they've disconnected economic outcomes from politics. That nobody expects the prime minister or the chief minister to actually create jobs, but they expect their MLA or their councillor or their panchayat to install the streetlights so millennial women can walk home safely. Or they expect their local MLA or his strong man to get a job at a warehouse for the farmer who committed suicide, his kids. So they expect these types of favors and smaller infrastructure projects that affect people's lives very greatly. They expect those to be delivered, but not macroeconomic progress like employment growth or GDP growth.
So who do they expect? Who do they expect that from?
They expect that from their MLAs and their panchayat.
No, the jobs. The MLA can't provide the jobs.
One thing that I write in my book is that in a large part of India, formal jobs are not a construct. So if you go to a town like Jabalpur, which is an urban, it used to be an industrial town, majority of the young, and you talk to majority of the young people over there, they'll say, oh, we don't have a job right now, but in 2 months, we're going to have to go back to the farm and help our family out with harvesting or with sowing. And when you have a situation like that, how is someone going to have a full-time job? Because you need to go back and help your family on the farm. So this construct or this idea of a formal job does not actually exist in many parts of India. So even people who deliver those jobs are not actually rewarded, because in a lot of cases, they're still required on the farms and they won't even be able to take those jobs.
It's a completely fascinating thing, and actually all good news for the ruling BJP, because the mud just doesn't seem to stick, even when there are empirical examples of mismanagement of COVID or the economy, as we've seen it, especially in the second wave. I've got a couple of minutes left. I have to ask you this. Millennials, in the cliche goes, are more conservative than our generation, more socially conservative, less rebellious. Does your research bear that out, especially when it comes to sex, marriage, maybe not sexuality so much, because some of the fights in terms of having a more accepting attitude to people's private choices on sexuality, those battles have already been fought and won to some degree. But when it comes to sex, marriage, other kinds of social conformism, what do you find?
Absolutely. I definitely find that millennials are more conservative than previous generations. And I think this is interesting also because we live in the 21st century where everyone is connected to each other with a smartphone and with Netflix and YouTube. 8 out of 10, more than 8 out of 10 married millennials today have had an arranged marriage. And almost 96% of those have happened within the caste group or within the community they're from. And this is 2016 data. This is not 1956 or 1996 data. This is 2016 data. Even if you go to many parts of the country and you see a group of young people and you ask them the community groups they come from, it's almost always homogenous. It's almost always from the same group of people. This doesn't necessarily imply social conservatism, but it does imply that in a lot of ways things haven't changed. And the reason I find that interesting is because Bollywood tells us a different story. Social media tells us a different story. The internet expects us to hear a different story, but that actually doesn't really exist. Now, there's many different reasons for it, but I think just on its own, it's a fascinating feature that I picked up, wherever I went.
What did young people say when you asked them?
Well, one of my interviews, I was in Cochin. I was at the law college in Cochin. And I was talking to a young Congress activist, and he's a Christian. And I asked him, he was, talking to me about liberalism and all of these great ideas. And I asked him, so, are you going to get married soon? He said, yeah, I'm going to have an arranged marriage, and my parents are going to find me a good Christian girl. And, I just found that very interesting because this is someone who is becoming a lawyer. He's talking a lot about many of these liberal
And
ideas.
there's like no embarrassment about it, right? Like when I was 18, if I spoke like this, like I would be considered like completely infra-dig in my social circle. I recognize
Exactly.
that my social circle, is a very minute, small, privileged social circle. I'm saying even within that small, privileged social circle, I find younger people much less willing to to question institutions.
Exactly. And that's the most fascinating feature of this generation, that we see films about revolution and rebellion and activism, but when you go and talk to majority of this generation, it's not something that actually exists
I
on
mean,
the
like
ground.
basically, like Bella Ciao is only a good song and not actually a sort of. There's no
It's
partisans on the
catchy.
ground.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. That of course brings us in the end to this entire cancel culture that is debated, right? And the sort of what Richa Chadha, the actor, had a very interesting phrase for it. She said, "Why doesn't someone call out woke fundamentalism? Because that is as fundamentalist a way of thinking as any other kind of extremism." What have you picked up on this, or is this again too urban centric, too privileged an issue to really matter to millions of young Indians?
No, I actually think this is an issue that does matter, but I view it from a completely different lens. That it is actually not the left in India that is canceling people, and it is not the left in India that is woke. It's the right. Woke culture is a term that came up in the United States, and if you look at a lot of the people who get cancelled over there, they're critics of the left. In the United States, there's a theory right now, it's called critical race theory, that America's institutions are fundamentally racist and we need to rewrite history from a new lens. Now, if you look at that, that's actually been happening in India. History has been rewritten in India, but not from the left, but from the right. We are being taught that many history is being interpreted from a completely new lens, like it is in the United States. And the people in India who are losing their jobs and who are being cancelled are those who do not subscribe to the narratives of the values of the right or the ruling government. Barkha, on Twitter, you recently shared an example. I can't remember the exact company, which was the subject of a smear campaign I think the company was run by Muslims, or I don't remember the
Yes,
exact.
fresh foods.
Fresh
Fresh foods.
foods, ID Fresh. Now, this is a
Yes.
classic example of cancel culture. But who is doing it? It's not the left that's
Yeah.
doing it, it's the right.
But is that
And
cancel culture, or is that's like, to me, like a kind of mob violence, sometimes virtual, sometimes actual, right? And when I think of cancel culture, I think of, let's say, what happened with J.K. Rowling and the trans community, what's happening with Enid Blyton, what's happening with, with Richa Chadha, because she had, admittedly, a very, very insensitive poster for one of her films where she's playing someone modeled on Mayawati, and they show her holding a broom in her hand. Yes, it was insensitive. Yes, people had the right to oppose it. But then she was just trolled in exactly the same language as the right wing would use. So do you really find that it's the right cancelling the left? Or do you see, signs of it on both sides of the trenches?
it might exist in smaller episodes on the left. I'm not familiar with the Richa Chadha example, to be honest with you. So it might exist on smaller episodes on the left. But a vast majority, and I say in terms of quantum, much more than what you even see in the United States or England or Europe, is being done by the right in India. And there's countless, and yes, mob violence exists, but even cancel culture exists. There's countless people who we don't hear from anymore because the government, I
Yeah.
mean, News Laundry
Yeah.
was raided yesterday.
Yeah.
If many people had the institutional support behind their cancel culture, they would also raid the offices of their critics. But News Laundry and News Click were raided yesterday. That is cancel culture, because you don't
Yeah.
like what they're saying. That is cancel culture.
So that's interesting. You actually feel in India the trend is reversed to what it is in many Western countries. I do have to close. I have to ask you one last question. In your survey and in the writing of this book, what was that one assumption that you made about millennials that you found was wrong, that you were
It's
surprised by?
it's sort of what we had spoken about, that you're going to have this generation that wants private sector jobs, that is pursuing love, that has many of these values that we saw on Bollywood or that we saw on social media. And when I went out in the field and I started talking to young people, everyone is like, hame to sarkari naukri chahiye, we want a government job. I'm of course going to have an arranged marriage. And so for me, what surprised me was how much similar things were to 20 years ago, or 3 decades ago, and that millennials are actually not all that different from previous generations. But what is different is the fact that there is aspiration, there is anxiety that did not exist earlier, but life in many ways is very similar to what we saw earlier.
Fascinating, though. Of course, some people of the previous generation would argue that we fought a lot more, we were a lot more rebellious and a lot more romantic at the same time. But I
Absolutely.
guess every generation says that about themselves. Vivan Marwaha's new book, What Millennials Want, you cannot afford to ignore what 440 million Indians are thinking.
Brilliant.
So do pick up your copy. Thanks, Vivan. Take care and see you soon.
Thank you, Barkha. Thanks for having me.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.